much for this very rich afternoon, and thank you all for your presentation. So we also welcome two additional speakers. So I kindly ask you maybe to shortly introduce yourself.
I'm Portuguese. I work at the General Directorate for Território. It's the National Authority for Spatial Planning in Portugal. And I'm a researcher at this institution, and we are mostly interested in solve problems at the national level. So how to incorporate the evaluation of ecosystem service in national policies, or how to influence regional, municipal policies to take ecosystem services and to value these services.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And Cees?
I am Cees WITHAGEN. I'm professor of environmental economics at the Department of Spatial Economics at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. We are a group of urban economists, transportation economists, environmental economists, GIS people. And about 3 years ago, I was approached by a colleague of mine, an econometrician, asking whether I would be willing to co-supervise a person working on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And I had written a few papers on biodiversity, but not on a practical level. So I was eager to learn, and I said yes, and this is Benoit, and that's why I'm here.
Thank you very much. So I know we have some time constraints, so yes, unfortunately. Yeah, so I would start with, so it's of course an interactive section. If you have questions, you can just pop up and ask your question. I would like to start with a question more on the modeling side, let's say, because we have seen maybe two examples of modeling, the one from INVEST and one from MIMES. We could say maybe that the MIMES one is an example of deductive approach based on causalities, and INVEST one is more data-driven, maybe. So how do you see these two approaches and the complementarities, and then if there are implications then for the policy decision-making process, meaning that it's important to support the policy decision-making process to know that how these two different approaches work. So maybe if you want to comment. Who wants to start? Ladies first.
Yes, that's a tough question to start with, the modeling philosophy. And yeah, I'll just mention that apologies, I need to leave 10 minutes before the end of the session. So it's not because of the quality of the discussion, of course. So I guess to answer your question, maybe I can say a few words about the INVEST modeling philosophy, and yeah, I would love to have your thoughts, Raul, on how they compare. Our approach is really deterministic in the sense that, as I mentioned, there are a number of rasters. So we have the biophysical data, we have the socioeconomic data, and then some simplified representation of ecological functions that are derived from these ecosystems, and then simplified representations of how the flow of the service actually provides benefits. So in that sense, it's quite a top-down approach, but we see the value in this approach in really being about providing maps and an easily accessible approach to providing these first estimates of ecosystem services. Which is why the philosophy has always been to have free and open source software that anyone can use and play with. So on that note, I'll just mention as well that we're working on a new data and technology platform to really make this workflow even easier. So it's, from a modeling perspective, it does make it look more like a black box in the sense that someone can just draw a square around the area of interest, and all the data would be pulled up directly from globally available data. If someone has better data, they can always provide it, but we're trying to develop this web tool that makes it even simpler to get a first idea of the provisioning of ecosystem services in an area. So that's our vision for the project, and I must admit that I'm not extremely familiar with the MIME's workflow for a new project, so I would love to have Royal's thoughts on this.
Thank you.
Yeah, MIMES and INVEST were kind of developed over the same time period. So I have been in many meetings and had this conversation many times with many, you know, Steve Pollack is a good friend of mine who developed the MIMES and all that. And at some point he was proposing to do a dynamic invest, and that lasted about a month because they weren't even to do it. And I'm like, why don't you just use the MIMES, right? But the philosophy of invest really is like make it as simple as possible. Everybody needs to be able to do it. The philosophy behind the MIMES is we're actually looking at pretty complex dynamics. So don't forget about the complexities. But what you really need to do is to make it less complicated for people to think through complexities. So we've been trying to reduce the complexity of running the model, of the complicatedness of running the model, but we're still trying to involve all the complexities. The choice on where you lay the complexity in MIMES really is when you know, I think most people are very complex thinkers. And as a modeler, you try to reduce the complexity. If you reduce it too much, you run into the problem that I hear of like a lot of people who get into this field, they start with the invest, right? And after doing it 2 or 3 times, they're like, this is kind of a toy. This is like, you know, I really need more complex thinking in that. And then you start to talking to people and you come to very complex models. And then other people get like, ooh, I'm so anxious, you know, this is way too much. So really we need to get the conversations with the people at exactly the right complexity and interactions that are typical for, you know, the case study that you're trying to, and that takes,
ad hoc approach.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah, much more in the story. Like we're in the story, really need, yeah.
This is quite time and resource consuming. That's the point.
Yeah, that is the point. But I have developed a system over the 10 years from now that I can probably whip you a model in like 2 days, and have it running. That is what a lot of people don't understand.
Yeah, please.
Can I say something more in general about the modeling? So I've been going through this process for a few years, and I know MIMES and other fancy names. But in economics, we would have a lot of discussion about the assumptions underlying these models. And as I experienced this meeting here, there's no question whatsoever about the assumptions underlying these models. And that's a bit strange to me. Moreover, Perrine already talked about black box. Many of these models are, as I can see it, they are huge. But it is important to pinpoint at the basic underlying assumptions, and that is something that I really miss. I was very happy when Lisa took the floor, and she also talked about monetary evaluation, because ultimately it's all about policy making, and the policymakers, they have to make a trade-off, and it can help to express these trade-offs in monetary terms. I'm not saying it will always be the case, but it can help. And then, of course, we have the problem with valuation, and of course there's a lot to say about that. But I would advocate also more valuation into these models.
Thank you. That's an ideal transition to my next question, indeed. It was how to make ecosystem service approach and valuation more attractive for policymakers, for example, for urban policymakers. So you, Fernando, and maybe also Rita, you showed a lot of examples of plans, of actions, and then how then this action can be valued, can be how the benefits out of this action can be evaluated from an ecosystem survey approach. So economic valuation can be one way to do it. That could be, let's say, understandable for policymakers. Are there other approach, or what are your thoughts? I don't know.
Risk maps or
risk and safety.
Yes, for instance, if you don't have monetary values, at least if you have the risk, if you can map the risk, it will be helpful.
I've done money valuations in many of my projects with NGOs. And I do that when I think I can actually get the good, but I never trust the numbers. And that is because a lot of the ecosystem services are actually things that you cannot really trade in the market. They're non-excludable and they're non-rival. So it's really hard to in that way to get into a money value of it. And so then you get into more what we saw in Lisbon, where a group of people, like a city, decides this is valuable. And let's, as a community, recognize that value and work towards that kind of goal. So that is not a money value, but that is like a group value that people actually express. So I'm not an economist enough to actually be able to calculate trade-offs in group value assessments. That's the challenge here.
I would like to make one correction. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm fully aware of the fact that the market prices don't reflect actual scarcity. That's why I'm an environmental economist. No?
Yeah.
So I'm not advocating at all that we use market prices in valuation. We need other prices, and there's a lot of research done to calculate such prices. Sorry.
Just one small addition. I mean, that's a really tough question you're putting out there. What do policymakers want? Because we work really close with policymakers in Cape Inca, and what policymakers want often changes from one month to the other, and it's always a combination of physical and monetary accounts, or like monetary values. And sometimes if we get the wrong it always depends on what message they also want to bring out to the public. So sometimes we could provide a monetary value, but it's not the right one in the way that doesn't fit the message they actually want to provide. So that's a really tough question, and we are working.
Why is so volatile?
Sorry?
Why is so volatile? Why is it so changing all the time? Do you have
I don't know. I'm not a policymaker, but it seems like it's just really depending on the political agenda in place right now, and that can change really quickly from one person in charge to the other. Yeah, but I give the microphone on.
Well, I could say that we sometimes speak about the substitution costs. If we have something, how much would it cost if we didn't have it to rebuild it? And sometimes we find out that, for example, to have a natural forest, it's so expensive and it takes so long to rebuild it that some people do, well, it's rather for us to have it. But we really don't like to speak about the financial issue. We prefer to speak about the cultural and social meaning. And for example, if we speak a language which induces the politician to decide in a certain way, and if there is no negative response from the social media, that was a good decision. And you can get the trusting from the politician if you always induce him to take the right decision. So the question is not to get too much passionate with some options that you are not steady enough. If you are making an option in terms of technician, try to be really acquainted of what you are inducing somebody to take a decision about it. Because if you fail, probably you are not going to be believed again. So this is very important, because nowadays, if you take for example, we rebuilt some trails, and the memory of the population is very small, and they didn't see that the trails were like this before. But once you do it, they say, well, you are artificializing the forest. There was a big complaint. And so we invited them to meetings, and we explained what we were doing, and we showed it with pictures that the trails already were like this. And so the social media and the media itself, they made such an explosion about it, but suddenly they said, they understood that that was the correct decision. And so they immediately went into shallow waters. And so for the politician, when he was invited to participate in a debate to discuss this, there was no discussion at all, because everybody was aware that that was the right decision. So for him, it was peaceful. It was just to communicate a success. And so this is far more important, to have a positive impact in your decisions. So if you are talking about risks, for example, this is something which for a politician it's very dangerous. And so this he is not going to discuss it. We are building artificial watersheds to retain the flooding, so that we are not going to have any more floods in Lisbon. And this is very, very expensive, and the money was never missing. There was always money for this. But if you want to build a corridor, a green corridor, it's more expensive, and it deals with another thing which is usually very fighting the ecological interests, which is the traffic. If you lower the speed of the traffic, there are going to be more traffic jams, and so the people begin to fight. So we are now preparing a communication campaign, so that the people, when the works are going to begin, the people are already acquainted about what we are going to do, what are we willing to reach with this work, and so on. So I think that most of the people are already environmental aware. The question is that the society makes them forget them. But if you just make them remembering it, probably they are going to be from your side and not against you.